It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Mark Evans, a seasoned mailman in his late 40s, made his usual rounds in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. The sun was just beginning to peek through the thick canopy of trees lining the street, casting dappled patterns on the pavement. Mark had walked this route for years, knowing nearly every resident by name and face. One of his regular stops was the cozy brick home of Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, a sweet but frail elderly widow who always greeted him with a warm smile and a cheerful wave. But that day, something was different. As Mark approached Eleanor's house, he noticed that the curtains, usually drawn open to let in the morning light, were tightly shut. Her mailbox, often empty by mid-morning, was stuffed to the brim with letters and catalogs. A faint unease settled in Mark's chest, but he brushed it off, thinking maybe Eleanor was having an off day. When he stepped onto the porch to leave her mail, Mark instinctively glanced toward the front window, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. That's when he saw her. Eleanor was sitting in her armchair near the window, but she wasn't her usual sprightly self. Her head was bowed, her posture slumped, and she seemed to be clutching something in her lap. Mark squinted, trying to make sense of the scene. He called out a soft "Good morning, Mrs. Grayson," but there was no response. She didn't even stir. Concerned, Mark shifted his weight, debating whether to knock. As his hand hovered over the door, he noticed something odd. Eleanor was wearing light beige pants, but there were dark stains on the fabric trailing down her legs. At first, Mark thought it might be spilled coffee or tea, but the stains looked wrong. They were too dark, too vivid. His stomach knotted as an unsettling thought crept in. Could she have hurt herself? Mark took a deep breath and knocked firmly on the door. "Mrs. Grayson, it's Mark, your mailman. Are you all right in there?" He leaned closer, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, a voice, even the shuffle of her chair. But all he got in return was silence. His heart raced as he knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Grayson, please let me know if you're okay." Still nothing. Mark's eyes darted to the windows, searching for any signs of movement, but Eleanor remained still. He decided to walk around to the side of the house, hoping to get a better view. As he passed by the small garden she loved to tend, he noticed the once vibrant flowers were now wilted, as if they hadn't been watered in days. The back door, usually locked, was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Mark's gut told him something was terribly wrong. Peering inside, he called out again, "Mrs. Grayson." "It's Mark. I'm coming in okay." The house was eerily quiet except for the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made his nose wrinkle. His pulse quickened as he stepped into the living room, where Eleanor still sat in her chair. Up close, the stains on her pants were unmistakable and deeply alarming. Mark hesitated for only a moment before pulling out his phone and dialing 911. His voice shook as he explained the situation to the operator, describing what he saw and pleading for them to hurry. As he waited, he couldn't help but notice more unsettling details. The scattered belongings on the coffee table, the faint trail of what looked like dried blood on the floor, and the way Eleanor's normally immaculate house seemed disheveled and out of place. What had happened here? And was it already too late to help her? Mark's mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary day, and Eleanor's life might depend on the choices he made in the next few minutes. This introduction creates suspense, establishes the characters and setting, and ends with an unresolved tension to keep viewers hooked for the next part. Mark's hand shook as he clutched his phone, waiting for the 911 operator to respond. The seconds felt like hours, and with every passing moment, the sense of urgency grew. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced around Eleanor's living room. The clutter, the stillness, it all felt wrong. Nothing was out of place in the way you'd expect for someone who had simply been under the weather. No half-finished cup of tea, no medicine bottles, just an unsettling silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice finally broke through the tension. Yes. Mark stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm at 217 Willow Creek Road. It's Mrs. Eleanor Grayson. She's not responding, and I need some later. She's been sitting in her chair for a long time. There are stains on her pants. I don't know what's going on, but I think she might be injured or worse." This introduction creates suspense, establishes the characters and setting, and ends with an unresolved tension to keep viewers hooked for the next part. Mark's hand shook as he clutched his phone, waiting for the 911 operator to respond. The seconds felt like hours, and with every passing moment, The sense of urgency grew. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced around Eleanor's living room. The clutter, the stillness, it all felt wrong. Nothing was out of place in the way you'd expect for someone who had simply been under the weather. No half-finished cup of tea, no medicine bottles, just an unsettling silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's voice finally broke through the tension. Yes. Mark stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm at 217 Willow Creek Road. It's Mrs. Eleanor Grayson. She's not responding, and I think something's seriously wrong. She's been sitting in her chair for a long time. There are stains on her pants. I don't know what's going on, but I think she might be injured or worse. Okay, sir, stay calm, the operator said, her tone calm but firm. Help is on the way. I need you to stay on the line. Is she breathing? Are you able to check? Mark stepped closer to Eleanor's chair. He couldn't bring himself to touch her, not yet. He had seen too many things that weren't right. Instead, he simply stood there, watching, waiting for any sign that she was alive. Her chest wasn't rising. There was no faint sound of a breath. He couldn't tell if she was unconscious or if she had been gone for much longer than he thought. The lack of movement was unbearable. She's not moving. I, I don't know, Mark said, his voice cracking. Please send someone. I can't tell if she's breathing. There's blood. I think, I think there's blood on her pants. Do not attempt to move her. Help is on the way, sir, the operator reassured him. Just stay with her. We'll send someone immediately. The line went silent as Mark clutched his phone tightly, unwilling to break the connection. He glanced around the room again, looking for any other clues that might explain what was happening. Eleanor's house, which had always been so tidy, felt different now. The usual warmth of her home, the smell of freshly baked cookies, the soft hum of her favorite classical music in the background was missing. Instead, the air was cold, still, almost suffocating. The floral patterned couch by the window, the same one she had spent countless afternoons on, was now empty. The pictures on the walls, once perfectly arranged, seemed crooked, as if disturbed by something. Mark's gaze drifted back to the coffee table. He noticed a small, leather-bound notebook tucked beneath a pile of mail. It was Eleanor's. He recognized it immediately. She had carried it with her for years, always jotting down notes about her gardening, her plans, and even the occasional personal reflection. Mark had always admired how organized she was, how meticulous. He had often wondered what she wrote in that book, but she never shared its contents with anyone. It was her private space, her sanctuary. Without thinking, Mark reached down and pulled the notebook out from under the pile. The worn pages felt fragile between his fingers, and for a moment he considered putting it back. But his curiosity got the better of him. He opened it to the first page, and as he scanned the words written in Eleanor's neat handwriting, his stomach twisted. The entries were dated, one by one, each one more disturbing than the last. The first page was filled with mundane details. The weather, a note about her grocery list, a reminder to water her plants. But as Mark turned the page, the tone shifted. There, scrawled in hurried, almost frantic handwriting, were the words, "They're watching me." His heart skipped a beat. Mark's mind raced. Who was watching her? He flipped to the next entry. "I hear them outside at night. The footsteps. I know they're here." The entries became increasingly erratic, as if Eleanor had slowly grown more paranoid over time. "The mailman came today," one read, "but I'm sure he knows. I can feel it. The others are getting closer." Another entry read, "I have to keep the windows closed. They can't get in. It's too dangerous." Mark felt his throat tighten as he read the words. What had Eleanor been so afraid of? Who were they? And why hadn't anyone noticed? Was it possible that her isolation had pushed her to the edge, that her mind had begun to unravel? Or was there something more sinister at play here? The doorbell rang, breaking Mark from his thoughts. He quickly shoved the notebook back onto the table, just as a loud knock echoed through the house. "Police? Open up," a voice shouted from outside. Relief flooded through Mark's body as he rushed to the front door and opened it, finding two officers standing on the porch, their faces grim. Behind them, an ambulance had pulled up, the paramedics already getting out and preparing their equipment. "I'm Mark Evans," he said quickly, stepping aside to let them in. "I'm the mailman. I found her like this. She's in the living room." The officers nodded and moved past him, following Mark inside. The paramedics followed close behind, their steps measured and quiet. Mark stood by the door, watching, helpless. The sound of footsteps faded as the team entered the living room. Mark heard the murmur of voices, but no one spoke directly to him. He could only make out fragments of their conversation. Unresponsive. Possible blood loss. Need to check vitals. Then silence. The kind of silence that told Mark everything he needed to know, but also nothing at all. His stomach churned as the minutes stretched on. One of the officers, a woman with short dark hair and a calm demeanor, stepped back into the hallway. She looked at Mark with a mix of concern and determination in her eyes. Sir, we're going to need to ask you a few questions. Could you tell me if Mrs. Grayson had any family, or has she mentioned anyone recently? Mark shook his head, still struggling to wrap his mind around everything. No, I don't know. She never mentioned anyone coming by. She mostly kept to herself. But, he paused, feeling the weight of his words. I don't know. I think there was something wrong with her lately. She seemed off. The officer nodded, jotting something down in her notebook. Do you know if she had any recent medical conditions or if she was seeing a doctor? No, Mark replied, his voice tight. She never said anything about being sick. She was always so independent, but I noticed something was different recently. Her house. He trailed off, unsure how to explain the unsettling changes he had noticed over the past few weeks. The windows always closed, the mailbox stuffed, the strange, anxious way she looked out the window when he delivered her mail. The officer studied him for a moment, then gestured for him to follow. We're going to need to take a look around. You're welcome to stay in the front room, but I think it's best if we talk later. Mark nodded, his mind still spinning with confusion and fear. What had happened to Eleanor? What had she been so afraid of? And could he have done something to help her sooner? As the officers moved through the house, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was at play. The stains on Eleanor's pants, the mysterious entries in her notebook, her final moments. Nothing seemed to add up, and the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if he had walked into something much bigger than he could have imagined. It was just the beginning. Mark sat quietly in the small front room of Eleanor's house, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. The officers had gone into the back of the house, and he could hear their voices now, muffled, as they went through each room, each corner of the house. It felt wrong to sit there while they worked, but he had no idea what else to do. He glanced around the room, taking in the familiar sight of Eleanor's living space. It looked normal, too normal almost. The yellowed curtains, the hand-knitted throw blanket on the couch, the little knickknacks she had collected over the years. It was hard to believe anything had changed in this home, but something had, and Mark couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was a connection between what he had found in the notebook and what was happening now. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Eleanor hadn't just been suffering from some random illness or accident. Something had terrified her. Something, or someone, had driven her to the brink. Her paranoia had been real, he now realized. The cryptic entries about being watched, the references to people closing in on her. It was all starting to paint a darker picture, one he wasn't prepared to face. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he quickly stood up. It was the officer, the one who had asked him about Eleanor's medical history earlier. She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. Her expression was neutral, but Mark could tell she was holding something back. We need to talk, she said, her voice low. It's about Eleanor. Mark's pulse quickened. What's going on? Is she? She's alive. The officer interrupted, but just barely. We're not sure yet what happened, but her condition is critical. She lost a lot of blood, and there's some trauma to her head. We've called for a medical team to take her to the hospital, but it doesn't look good. Mark felt a wave of relief mixed with dread. She was alive. Barely, but still, it wasn't the news he had hoped for. Is there any chance she was hurt on her own? Mark asked. Could she have fallen or something? The officer hesitated, her eyes narrowing as if weighing her words. We're still investigating that, but there's evidence to suggest she didn't fall. Her injuries are consistent with something more deliberate. It looks like she was attacked, Mark. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Attacked? By who? Why? I'm not sure yet, the officer said, shaking her head. But there's something strange about this whole situation. You said she was acting paranoid, right? Did she mention anyone who might have been causing her distress? Mark recalled the entries in the notebook, the vague references to people watching her, the feeling of being hunted. He hesitated. She never gave names. But she did say something strange once. I remember she mentioned hearing footsteps outside her house at night. She thought someone was following her. The officer nodded. It's possible she was onto something. We found footprints outside the back door, and they weren't hers. They don't match any shoes in the house either. It's starting to look like someone was in here, watching her, possibly even waiting for the right moment to hurt her. Mark's stomach twisted. Who would want to hurt Eleanor? She had always been kind to everyone in the neighborhood. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Maybe someone was trying to silence her. The thought made his chest tighten with fear. He didn't know what kind of trouble Eleanor had gotten herself into, but it was becoming clear that this wasn't just an accident. The officer seemed to sense his growing unease. We'll need to talk to everyone who had contact with her recently, she said. Neighbors, friends, even you? We're trying to get a sense of who might have been involved in this. Mark felt a sense of unease settle over him. He had been her mailman, sure, but had he really known her that well? How much had he truly understood about the elderly woman who had quietly lived on his rope for years? Maybe he had missed something. Maybe there had been signs he hadn't recognized. Maybe he could have helped her sooner notice the warning signs before things escalated. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The officer turned and nodded toward the doorway. We'll be conducting a thorough search of the house. We need to see if there's anything else here that could help us understand what happened. Mark watched as the officers moved through the house again, this time more methodically, opening drawers, pulling items off shelves, and even checking behind the furniture. He followed them, despite the sense that he was trespassing in a place that no longer felt familiar. They checked every room, from the kitchen to the bedroom, and even the attic. As they searched, Mark's thoughts wandered back to the notebook. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that there was something in those pages that could unlock the mystery of what had happened to Eleanor. The entries were cryptic, yes, but there had to be a thread to follow. He needed to understand who she had been afraid of, and why. The officer who had been questioning him earlier stopped near the bookshelf and pulled out an old photo album. She flipped through the pages slowly, her brow furrowed. This doesn't make sense, she muttered under her breath. Mark stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. What is it? He asked. The officer held up a photograph. It was of Eleanor, smiling, standing beside a man he didn't recognize. They were at some kind of family gathering, maybe a wedding or a holiday dinner. The man in the photo looked much younger than Eleanor, but there was something unsettling about the way he was standing next to her. His eyes were hard to read, but they were hiding something. Do you recognize this man? The officer asked. Mark took a good look at the picture. No, I've never seen him before. That's what I thought, she said. But we found something strange in the attic. There's a box of old letters, and some of them are signed by this man. He's listed as Eleanor's nephew. His name's Greg, but no one seems to remember her ever mentioning him. It's like he disappeared from her life a long time ago. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The photo was old, maybe decades old, but why had Eleanor kept it? Why had she hidden the letters? Had Greg returned? Had he been the one who had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to confront her? His mind was swirling, but he knew one thing for sure. The mystery was deepening. Eleanor's paranoia, the strange man from her past, the unexplained injuries. None of it made sense. But Mark was starting to feel that he was right in the middle of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. As the officers continued their search, Mark's thoughts drifted back to the notebook, the cryptic entries, and the haunting feeling that someone somewhere was still watching. He couldn't shake the sense that the answers were within his reach. But what would it cost him to find them? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but there was still so much left unsaid. And for Mark, the terrifying truth was that he might not want to know the whole story. The days following Eleanor's hospitalization felt like they stretched on endlessly for Mark. The investigation had taken over every corner of the quiet neighborhood, and the officer's questions kept echoing in his mind. He had tried to go back to his normal routine, but everything about this situation weighed heavily on him. Every time he passed her house, he found himself looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. The eerie silence in the air seemed to follow him everywhere, the kind of silence that spoke of something unspeakable waiting to be uncovered. The investigation had intensified, and while the police had gotten more leads, they had yet to connect all the dots. Mark had tried to keep himself busy, but the nagging feeling in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. He found himself returning to the old photo album, the one the officer had shown him, staring at that photograph of Eleanor with the strange man, Greg. He couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that Eleanor had been hiding something more than just fear. Had she known this man was coming back into her life? Had she tried to warn him? Or was she protecting something or someone else? Each day, the neighborhood felt quieter. Neighbors seemed to be avoiding Eleanor's house now, whispering behind closed doors. Mark knew that everyone was on edge, as if the mere presence of the police had somehow stirred something dark and dangerous within the neighborhood. Every creak of the old houses, every movement in the corners of his vision, made him wonder if Greg, or whoever was responsible for what had happened to Eleanor, was still nearby watching. Late one evening, Mark received a call from Officer Daniels, the lead investigator in the case. He could hear the urgency in her voice. "Mark, I need you to come down to the station. We found something new, something you might want to see." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected a breakthrough so soon, and the suddenness of the call made his stomach churn. "What is it? Is it about Eleanor?" "Yes, but you need to see this for yourself. It's about Greg," she said before hanging up. Mark didn't waste a second. He grabbed his coat, hurried out the door, and drove straight to the police station. The city lights flickered through the windshield, but his mind was on one thing and one thing only. What had they discovered? What had they learned about Greg? He had spent so many sleepless nights trying to figure out how everything connected, and now he felt closer than ever to the truth. When he arrived, Officer Daniels was waiting for him. She led him into a small conference room, where the atmosphere was thick with tension. On the table lay a set of files, photographs, and a couple of pieces of evidence Mark hadn't seen before. Officer Daniels motioned for him to sit down. "Take a look at these," she said, sliding one of the photographs over to him. It was a photo of Greg. Mark recognized him immediately from the old picture in Eleanor's album. But this new photograph was much more recent. It was a grainy shot of a man standing in a parking lot, glancing over his shoulder as if he was trying to avoid being seen. His eyes, cold and calculating, looked directly into the camera, and Mark could feel a shiver run down his spine. "Where did this come from?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Mark Evans, a seasoned mailman in his late 40s, made his usual rounds in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. The sun was just beginning to peek through the thick canopy of trees lining the street, casting dappled patterns on the pavement. Mark had walked this route for years, knowing nearly every resident by name and face. One of his regular stops was the cozy brick home of Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, a sweet but frail elderly widow who always greeted him with a warm smile and a cheerful wave. But that day, something was different. As Mark approached Eleanor's house, he noticed that the curtains, usually drawn open to let in the morning light, were tightly shut. Her mailbox, often empty by mid-morning, was stuffed to the brim with letters and catalogs. A faint unease settled in Mark's chest, but he brushed it off, thinking maybe Eleanor was having an off day. When he stepped onto the porch to leave her mail, Mark instinctively glanced toward the front window, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. That's when he saw her. Eleanor was sitting in her armchair near the window, but she wasn't her usual sprightly self. Her head was bowed, her posture slumped, and she seemed to be clutching something in her lap. Mark squinted, trying to make sense of the scene. He called out a soft "Good morning, Mrs. Grayson," but there was no response. She didn't even stir. Concerned, Mark shifted his weight, debating whether to knock. As his hand hovered over the door, he noticed something odd. Eleanor was wearing light beige pants, but there were dark stains on the fabric trailing down her legs. At first, Mark thought it might be spilled coffee or tea, but the stains looked wrong. They were too dark, too vivid. His stomach knotted as an unsettling thought crept in. Could she have hurt herself? Mark took a deep breath and knocked firmly on the door. "Mrs. Grayson, it's Mark, your mailman. Are you all right in there?" He leaned closer, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, a voice, even the shuffle of her chair. But all he got in return was silence. His heart raced as he knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Grayson, please let me know if you're okay." Still nothing. Mark's eyes darted to the windows, searching for any signs of movement, but Eleanor remained still. He decided to walk around to the side of the house, hoping to get a better view. As he passed by the small garden she loved to tend, he noticed the once vibrant flowers were now wilted, as if they hadn't been watered in days. The back door, usually locked, was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Mark's gut told him something was terribly wrong. Peering inside, he called out again, "Mrs. Grayson." "It's Mark. I'm coming in okay. The house was eerily quiet except for the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made his nose wrinkle. His pulse quickened as he stepped into the living room, where Eleanor still sat in her chair. Up close, the stains on her pants were unmistakable and deeply alarming. Mark hesitated for only a moment before pulling out his phone and dialing 911. His voice shook as he explained the situation to the operator, describing what he saw and pleading for them to hurry. As he waited, he couldn't help but notice more unsettling details. The scattered belongings on the coffee table, the faint trail of what looked like dried blood on the floor, and the way Eleanor's normally immaculate house seemed disheveled and out of place. What had happened here? And was it already too late to help her? Mark's mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary day, and Eleanor's life might depend on the choices he made in the next few minutes. This introduction creates suspense, establishes the characters and setting, and ends with an unresolved tension to keep viewers hooked for the next part. Mark's hand shook as he clutched his phone, waiting for the 911 operator to respond. The seconds felt like hours, and with every passing moment, the sense of urgency grew. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced around Eleanor's living room. The clutter, the stillness, it all felt wrong. Nothing was out of place in the way you'd expect for someone who had simply been under the weather. No half-finished cup of tea, no medicine bottles, just an unsettling silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice finally broke through the tension. Yes. Mark stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm at 217 Willow Creek Road. It's Mrs. Eleanor Grayson. She's not responding, and I need to tell her. She's been sitting in her chair for a long time. There are stains on her pants. I don't know what's going on, but I think she might be injured or worse. What if it was Greg? What if it was someone who knew too much? What if Eleanor had tried to warn him, but he hadn't understood the full danger? A soft thud came from the kitchen. Mark's pulse quickened as he crept toward the source, his body tense with anticipation. He peered around the corner, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready to react at the slightest movement. What he saw froze him in his tracks. Standing in the kitchen was not Greg. It was Eleanor. But it wasn't the same Eleanor he remembered. Her face was pale, drawn with exhaustion, and her eyes were wide with a panic that was all too familiar. She looked at Mark, her hand shaking as she gripped the edge of the counter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air thickened, and Mark felt a chill run through him. Eleanor? Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. She had been in the hospital bed just hours ago, barely hanging on, and now she was standing in front of him, alive and breathing. But it wasn't just that. There was something wrong, something off about the way she was looking at him. Mark, Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse as if she hadn't spoken in days. She stepped toward him, but something about her movements seemed too deliberate, too controlled. It was almost as if she were acting. You need to leave. They'll find you here. They'll come for you next. Mark's throat tightened. Eleanor, I don't understand. You were in the hospital. How did you get out? What's going on? Who's coming for us? Her gaze flickered, darting over his shoulder toward the back door, as if she was afraid someone would overhear. I never went to the hospital, Mark, she said, her words low and urgent. They staged it. They made you believe I was sick. They had to keep me out of sight. They'll do the same to you if they find out you're involved. Mark felt a wave of confusion crash over him. Involved in what? What are you talking about? Who are they? Her eyes locked onto his, a frantic intensity in her gaze that made his stomach twist. You're asking the wrong questions, Mark. Don't trust anyone. Not the police. Not the neighbors. Not even Lee. Mark's head spun. Everything he had thought he knew, the investigation, the search for Greg, the cryptic messages in the notebook, none of it made sense anymore. Eleanor was alive, but why had she lied about it? Why had she told him not to trust anyone? He opened his mouth to ask more, but before he could speak, the unmistakable sound of the door slamming somewhere in the house shattered the silence. Eleanor's face paled even further. They're here, she gasped, her voice shaking. They'd found me. Mark's mind raced, but he didn't have time to think. The footsteps, the creaking floorboards, the panic in Eleanor's voice. It was all coming together too fast. They were no longer the only ones in the house. Without thinking, Mark grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door. He didn't know who or what was after them, but the fear in Eleanor's eyes was enough to drive him forward. The seconds stretched out, each one more agonizing than the last, as they scrambled through the darkened hallway toward the door that led to the backyard. As Mark yanked open the door, the night air hit him like a blast of cold water. He pulled Eleanor outside, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was following them. The yard was quiet, the shadows long and thick, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. It felt like they were being watched, as if the world had gone silent to wait for the next move. Eleanor tugged at his sleeve, pulling him toward the alley at the side of the house. "We need to go. Now." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Mark wanted to ask her more questions, to demand answers, but he knew they didn't have time. He could feel it in his gut. Whatever was happening, whatever Eleanor had been hiding, it was all about to come crashing down, and he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole really went. As they made their way through the alley, the sound of a car engine started up in the distance. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a car. It was the unmistakable sound of a black SUV, a vehicle he had seen parked at the end of the block several times over the past few days. The same one that had been near Eleanor's house when the police arrived. Eleanor stopped in her tracks, pulling him back into the shadows. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. "They're coming for us," she whispered. "We need to go further. They'll stop at nothing." Mark's mind raced. Who were they? What was Eleanor hiding? Who could possibly be watching them with so much determination? As he peered around the corner, he saw the SUV driving slowly down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator hunting its prey. The tension was unbearable. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to get as far away from Eleanor and this madness as possible. But a deeper part of him, the part that couldn't let go of the mystery, the part that needed to understand what was going on, knew there was no turning back now. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. The SUV stopped a few houses down. Mark's grip tightened on Eleanor's arm. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching. More than one set, too many to count. There was no way they could outrun them. The situation had gone from bad to worse in a matter of minutes. And now, as the sound of voices grew closer, Mark realized that the real danger wasn't just Greg. It was something much bigger, something that had been lying in wait for a long time. Mark turned to Eleanor, desperate for any kind of answer, but she was already gone. In the blink of an eye, she had disappeared into the shadows, leaving him standing alone, caught between the unknown and the darkness closing in around him. The footsteps were getting louder, and this time, Mark wasn't sure who would come for him first. Mark's heart pounded as he stood in the shadows, the voices drawing closer with every passing second. He could see the glow of the SUV's headlights in the distance, casting long shadows on the ground, and his mind raced. Where had Eleanor gone? Why had she disappeared so suddenly? Was she trying to save him, or was she leading him into a trap? The footsteps stopped just around the corner, and Mark held his breath, his entire body tense for the worst. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that made everything feel too still, too dangerous. Then a figure appeared at the end of the alley. It was a man, tall and imposing, dressed in dark clothing that blended into the night. His face was hidden by a hood, but Mark could feel the weight of his gaze, as if the man was looking directly at him. Mark took a step back, ready to bolt, but before he could move, another figure emerged from the darkness. This time it was Eleanor. She stepped out from behind a stack of crates, her eyes wide with fear, but something in her expression had changed. There was no longer panic or confusion. Instead, it was like a mask had slipped into place, revealing something Mark hadn't seen before. Cold determination. Eleanor's eyes met Mark's, and for a split second, he felt a jolt of recognition, like a puzzle piece snapping into place. "They're here," she whispered, but it wasn't the same fearful tone she had used before. This time her voice was calm, controlled, as though she had already made a decision. "You need to trust me, Mark, now." The man who had been standing in the alley moved toward them, and Mark instinctively took a step back. He could see now that there were more of them, hidden in the shadows. Several figures, all wearing dark clothing, were closing in from different angles, their faces masked and their movements deliberate. They were a team, organized, efficient, and terrifyingly silent. Mark's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. Who were they? What had Eleanor gotten herself involved in? "Mark," Eleanor said again, her voice urgent. "They've been watching us, watching you. The only way to survive this is if you come with me. There's no other choice." Mark's head spun. He felt trapped, cornered between the unknown figures and Eleanor, who had suddenly turned into someone he couldn't recognize. He wanted to ask her so many questions. Why she had lied about her hospitalization, what these people wanted, why they were here. But all of it seemed irrelevant now. The danger was real, and the only thing that mattered was getting out alive. Before he could speak, the man who had been standing at the end of the alley stepped forward. His voice was deep, gravelly, and filled with authority. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor," he said, his tone cold but not unkind. "You know what happens if you don't follow orders. And you, Mark? Well, you're in over your head." Eleanor flinched at the mention of her name, but she didn't back down. Instead, she moved closer to Mark, her hand brushing against his arm in a gesture that felt almost protective. "You don't know the Mark," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "But they know you. They've been tracking you. They think you're a threat now. They think you're part of something. Something much bigger than this. You've got to trust me. I'm trying to protect you." Mark was paralyzed, his mind racing to piece everything together. These people weren't just ordinary criminals. They weren't after Eleanor because of something personal. No, this was something deeper, something organized. He could feel the weight of it pressing in on him, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They had been tracking him all along. For the first time since the chaos had started, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. The truth was far darker than Mark had imagined. Gray hadn't just come back to finish something he'd started. He wasn't alone. He was part of something much bigger, something hidden in the shadows. A network of people working together for reasons Mark couldn't understand. And now, Mark was caught in the middle of it, an unwilling pawn in a game he had never asked to play. Greg's lips twisted into a tight smile as he stepped closer. "You think you've been protecting him, Eleanor? You've only made it worse. He's already marked, just like you." Mark's eyes darted between Eleanor and Greg, trying to process the words. "Marked? What did that mean?" Before he could ask, Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, something metallic that glinted in the dim light of the alley. She held it out in front of her fingers trembling slightly as she pointed it at Greg. "I know who you really are, Greg," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving his. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." For a moment, everything went still. The figures behind Greg tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. But then, before Mark could react, Eleanor pressed a button on the object she was holding, and the sound of a gunshot rang out in the alley. But it wasn't a gun. It was a signal, one that Mark barely recognized, but one that clearly had an immediate impact. A faint low hum filled the air as a series of lights suddenly illuminated the alley from above, blinding the figures surrounding them. Mark squinted against the glare, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around him. And then he saw it. Dozens of black SUVs and unmarked cars speeding down the street, their sirens blaring, their headlights cutting through the darkness. It wasn't the police. It wasn't Greg's people. It was something else entirely. A voice crackled through a hidden speaker in Mark's ear. One that he didn't recognize. "This is your last chance, Mark," the voice said, cold and commanding. "Come with us. Leave all of this behind." Mark stood there, his head spinning, the weight of the decision crashing down on him. He had no idea who was behind the voice or what they wanted. But one thing was certain. Eleanor had just betrayed Greg, and now everything was about to change. The world he knew was falling apart, and Mark was caught in the middle of a battle he didn't even understand. In the blink of an eye, Eleanor turned and ran, disappearing into the night as the world around Mark erupted into chaos. And in that final moment, Mark realized the truth. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was part of something much larger, a story that was far from over. Mark stood frozen, the world around him spinning in disarray. The chaotic blur of lights and sirens was enough to disorient anyone. But as Eleanor disappeared into the shadows, something clicked in Mark's mind. He had no time to process everything, no time to ask the questions that were swirling inside him. He just had to keep moving. The voice over the speaker in his ear echoed once more, cold and unwavering. "This is your last chance, Mark." Mark didn't know who they were, but he knew one thing: they were prepared to take him by force if necessary. He could feel the eyes of Greg's men on him, their gazes sharp as they moved toward him. But something had shifted, something in the air, a sense of urgency that told Mark he needed to choose. The sirens grew louder, the approaching cars like a stampede of something much bigger than himself. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt the weight of his own choices. Eleanor had set this in motion, but now it was his turn to decide how it ended. Greg's people were closing in, but so were the mysterious figures who had contacted him. He felt trapped, caught between two worlds, one that had been hidden from him for so long, and one that had just begun to reveal itself in its terrifying, all-encompassing form. With his heart pounding, Mark moved. He didn't know if it was the right choice, but instinct told him to follow the lights, to trust the mysterious voice that had been guiding him. He pushed past Greg's men, the figure who had once been Eleanor's tormentor, now standing helpless, confused, watching as Mark disappeared into the night. The night air felt cold and fresh against his skin as he ran toward the approaching vehicles. Mark glanced over his shoulder, his thoughts racing. He could hear the footsteps, the pursuit getting closer. The figures behind him weren't going to give up without a fight, but something in him told him that what was ahead held more answers than what he was leaving behind. Just as he reached the edge of the alley, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of him, its headlights casting long, menacing shadows over the pavement. The door swung open, and a tall woman stepped out, her dark eyes scanning him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, like she could see right through him. She didn't say a word but motioned for him to get in. Without hesitation, Mark slipped into the passenger seat, the door slamming shut behind him. The car pulled away with speed, cutting through the streets like it was part of a well-rehearsed plan. Mark's pulse didn't slow, but the sensation of being chased began to fade. As the car turned a corner, he felt the grip of uncertainty ease just a little. There was no turning back now. "Where are we going?" Mark asked, his voice low, still trying to understand what was happening. The woman, who had barely acknowledged his presence, glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. "You'll be brief soon enough. Right now, we're getting you out of here." Mark wanted to ask more, but something in her tone stopped him. He knew that for now, answers weren't going to come easy. He had learned that much in the past few days. Every answer led to more questions, and every question led to deeper, darker truths. But as the car sped away from the chaos, Mark couldn't help but wonder about Eleanor. Where had she gone? What had she meant when she said it's over? Was she a part of this mysterious organization, or had she betrayed him completely? They drove for what seemed like hours, but in truth, it was probably only 20 minutes before the car pulled into an unmarked building on the outskirts of the city. The place looked like a warehouse, bland, unassuming, and nondescript. The woman parked the car in a dimly lit corner, and they got out in silence. Mark followed her inside, his mind still racing. The building was cold, its walls barren and sterile. It didn't feel like the kind of place where answers were supposed to come, but it had the look of something that had been prepared in advance. The woman led him down a narrow hallway, stopping in front of a steel door. She knocked twice, then entered without waiting for a response. Inside, there was a small group of people, men and women, all dressed in nondescript clothing, their faces sharp with focus. At the center of the room sat a man behind a desk, his face obscured by shadows. He looked up as they entered, his piercing gaze fixed on Mark. "So, you're the one," the man said, his voice gravelly but controlled. "Mark, was it?" Mark nodded slowly. "I'm not sure what's going on. What do you want from me?" The man smiled, but it was cold, calculating. "We don't want anything from you, Mark. You've been marked, whether you knew it or not. And now you're in our world. There's no escaping it." Mark's confusion deepened, but the man continued, his tone almost sympathetic. "You were always a part of this, whether you realized it or not. Eleanor knew it too. She was trying to protect you, but in the end she couldn't. None of us can escape what's coming." Mark's head spun as the man's words sank in. He had known Eleanor for years. She was his neighbor, the woman who had always seemed so kind, so ordinary. But none of this had felt ordinary. The mystery of Greg, the cryptic messages, the strange warnings. It was all a part of a much larger, dangerous game. And Mark had just become a player. The woman who had brought Mark in stepped forward now, her voice quiet but firm. "You're part of a network, Mark. A network that has been tracking certain individuals, people who have unwittingly become involved in this operation. You were part of it from the beginning, whether you knew it or not. Eleanor was trying to get you out before it was too late." Mark's mind reeled. "What operation? Who are you people?" The man behind the desk leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "We're a group dedicated to ensuring that the world remains in balance. Eleanor, unfortunately, became too involved in something dangerous, something that could have unraveled everything. That's why she had to disappear. And now you're here because you're the last piece of the puzzle. What happens next is up to you." Mark was left speechless, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had been thrust into a world he couldn't comprehend, surrounded by people who knew far more than he did. But one thing was clear. Everything had been leading to this moment. Eleanor had tried to protect him, but now the truth was out, and Mark was at the center of a conflict far larger than himself. As the man stood up, signaling the end of their conversation, he looked Mark dead in the eyes. Your choices matter now, Mark. What you do next will determine the course of everything. But be warned, nothing is as it seems, and no one can be trusted, not even those closest to you. As Mark left the building, he felt the weight of those words. The world he had once known had changed forever. The mysteries, the dangers, the betrayals, all of it was part of something larger than he could ever have imagined. And as he walked into the unknown, Mark realized that the journey was far from over. The story had just begun.